just as we start, there'll be like this big, massive.
Oh, I think we're started now. Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining this live stream today. My name is Andrea, and I work as the VP of Public Engagement at the Canadian Women's Foundation. I am also joined by Paulette Senior, our President and CEO at the Canadian Women's Foundation, and also our board chair, who is also with us. Her name is Angela Johnson, and she is also going to speak with us today. I just wanted to do some housekeeping in the beginning. If anything happens during this live stream, like we get cut off or anything strange happens, please just hang tight and we're going to come back on as soon as we can. Sometimes there's those technical difficulties. So I just wanted to flag that for you. Please don't be too concerned. We'll get right back at it. To give you just a bit of an introduction about the Canadian Women's Foundation. The Canadian Women's Foundation is Canada's public foundation for diverse women and girls. We address the distinct barriers that diverse women and girls in this country face that require distinct solutions because we know that gender equality improves economic and social conditions for everyone. We aim to be inclusive of diverse people across gender and sexuality spectrums, and we focus our efforts on supporting those who face the most barriers and have the least access to relevant services and supports. Of course, this includes people who identify as women and girls, trans, genderqueer, non-binary, and 2S LGBTQ+ folks. To learn more about the Canadian Women's Foundation and the work that we do, you can visit our website at canadianwomen.org. So we're going to move specifically to our topic today. We know that a gender equal Canada cannot be achieved without an end to police misconduct and brutality and an end to systemic racism at large. Our President and CEO, Paulette Senior, and our Board Chair, Angela Johnson, will address important considerations in challenging anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and discriminatory institutional practices, policies, and cultures in the journey towards equity. They'll address the intertwined goals of gender and racial justice and share the action steps being taken right now by the Canadian Women's Foundation. I will pass it over to them to introduce themselves in a minute, but I just want to start by acknowledging that the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and the organizations that we support across the country takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are very grateful for the opportunity to work on this land, but we recognize that land acknowledgements are simply not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make sure that we are right with all our relations. So I'm going to pass the floor right now to Paulette and Angela. I'm going to pop off the screen, and then afterwards, I'm going to pop back on to support with the Q&A portion. If you have questions, please, of course, add them to the chat box, and we'll try to get to them at some point. Okay, so passing off to Paulette and Angela. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for organizing this event, to my colleagues, Andrea and her team on the public engagement team at the Canadian Women's Foundation. My name is Paulette Senior. It's a pleasure to be here. And, you know, I do want to say that as the presidency of the Canadian Women's Foundation, I think my board chair, Angela, and I, we find ourselves at a unique time in history. And having an uncommon conversation that I think needs to be much more commonplace in organizations like ours, but also in organizations unlike ours. We're in a time where I think it's important that we are having what could otherwise be termed as courageous conversations about what's happening in our world. We are at a unique point right now where we're looking at how we're going to live through this pandemic, but also live through the pandemic within the pandemic that is anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. And so I am particularly proud to be leading the Canadian Women's Foundation at this point in my career, but at this point in history, that we can bring this conversation to the fore and to make it mainstream so that we can open the space to have more and more of these conversations. So I'll turn it over to Angela to also introduce herself.
Thank you, Paulette. And I echo your thanks to Andrea and her team, and echo a lot of your sentiments around the position that we are in today to have this courageous conversation amongst what is everybody is experiencing, very tumultuous 4 or 5 months. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm the current chair of the Canadian Women's Foundation. I've been with the Canadian Women's Foundation for 6 years. It's been my pleasure to be on the board, supporting and guiding the work for that length of time. And it's my pleasure to be here today to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion. So my role in today's conversation is to provide a bit of the context for the discussion, and it's a tough one. As Paulette mentioned, we are in unprecedented times. I think we've heard that often. And the most recent, what's the word that encapsulates what we're going through? The most recent chapter of this book that we're in has been traumatic for a lot of us. So, because we know that the tragic killings of Black and Indigenous people and encounters with the police have again come to the forefront of public discussion, protest, and community action in Canada and the United States, is why we're here today with you. It was the recent, unnecessary, and tragic murder of George Floyd in the United States that has sparked the most recent outcry, as we know. But in Canada, we sadly remember Chantel Moore, Regis Krichinski-Paquette, and DeAndre Campbell. And these are just 3 killed this year in the course of police wellness checks. Many others were killed before that. And the experience of many more people have not entered into public consciousness because they didn't die. Still, they were scrutinized, targeted, harassed, and attacked in police encounters. And we wonder about the many unheard cases that don't make the news. Mine is one. I was on the other end of a wellness check or a street check here in Nova Scotia several years ago. I was traveling with my cousin. I was visiting from New Glasgow, where I lived at the time, a smaller town in Nova Scotia, and we were pulled over. And it was the first time I'd experienced such suspicion and animosity, and it confused me. I couldn't figure out what we had done. To be treated with such disdain and expectation of wrongdoing. So that one experience, rightly or wrongly, has tainted my interaction with law enforcement and my own suspicion when I encounter law enforcement, driving Black or walking Black in our country. In early June, in response to the recent incidents, the Canadian Women's Foundation released an action statement of police misconduct and brutality, focusing on the high risks particularly faced by Black and Indigenous people in Canada. Desmond Cole's telling 2015 article spoke to being interrogated by the police more than 50 times simply for being Black. None of these cases had ever made the news until he wrote about the experiences himself. Again, in my province of Nova Scotia, well-known ex-boxer Kirk Johnson, his case was also fairly well known. He filed a complaint with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, alleging that he was pulled over and harassed because he's a Black man. And at the time, he reported that he'd been stopped 28 times in a 5-year time period. The result of that was that the Halifax police had to provide him with an award of $10,000, and his additional efforts warranted an apology, and a police advisory group was struck to review the practices of the Halifax police force in Nova Scotia. So all of this is why it is of critical importance that we listen to the lived experiences of Black and Indigenous people on issues of racism. Since Desmond Cole wrote his book and Kirk Johnson had his result, even more terrible cases have happened and have come to light. One of the things that we've noticed is that many of these stories have familiar patterns. Many occur in the context of wellness or street checks. The police are called in around a plea for help, and the person who needs help ends up being dead or harmed. There's also a question of how police treat those with mental health concerns. They always seem to begin with an aggressive stance or rough treatment immediately. For example, the choke holding that we've seen vividly on the news recently, pinning, head injuries, screaming, shouting, those types of treatments we've witnessed and others have experienced. There's also a question of strategy, de-escalation, and presumption of guilt or a threat on the part of the police. After an investigation, there is rarely anyone or any system held accountable. There's also a question about the effectiveness and biases of law enforcement. There's a watchdog process and a general police accountability that is missing. So we also hear that it's the fault of individual police officers, but it can't only be this. The behaviors of individual officers are of course grounded in police policies, procedures, practices, and institutional culture. In Canada, the law enforcement system is in every province and territory is rooted in colonial history and its long-standing racist power imbalances. We know this and we've experienced it. It's in this colonial context that Indigenous and Black individuals and communities are not afforded the safety, the respect, the freedom, and care that is their right. Instead, they experience high levels of discrimination and difficult economic, social, and health outcomes and are not equally served and protected by police. So with this context in mind, what can we do? I'll turn it over now to Paulette to talk about some opportunities for sector leadership.
Thanks, Angela. That's all so sobering, and thank you for sharing your own personal example, because one of the things that non-Black Canadians don't realize is that if they ask us, we will share those examples, and the accumulation of those examples are really what we are talking about today. It's the accumulated effect and impact on us as Black Canadians, as Indigenous people living in Canada, that we know that when you talk about equality and justice, that it escapes us because we're not experiencing or living or walking in the same shoes as other Canadians. And so that's why I really appreciate this conversation today. That's why I appreciate the fact that as a sector leader, that I can talk about these issues as well. Not just as being a woman, as being a Black woman in Canada, but also as a Black woman leader. So I do know that broadly this has been a terrible, had terrible consequences in Canada, and that they're gendered. So for Black and Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit, trans and non-binary people, it means that we cannot safely call the police when we need help. That's what it means. Because we've seen so much of that resulting in harm and death. And there's no escape from abusive situations while they are simultaneously targeted by police and as threats and living at high risk of gender-based violence. So imagine as a Black woman that your partner is being abusive to you. And instead of thinking about how you can keep yourself safe, you're actually choosing between your own safety and perhaps even the life of your partner, whether or not your partner will survive because you've called the police. That's not a situation that we want people to be in. I don't want to be in that situation. Women do not want to be in this situation. Why should you have to choose between your own life and that of your partner? Now, of course, I'm going to say I'm going to choose my life, but I didn't ask the police to actually come in and kill my partner. And that's what many women are actually having to think about, particularly Black and Indigenous women. And so for Black and Indigenous mothers and caregivers, it means that they're carrying a great weight of anxiety and grief and care work for their children, their families and communities, because you're living not just with what every other woman's living with, but your Black and Indigenous identity causes you to always be thinking of this pressing matter of racism that in itself really stifles your ability to live. And so for Black Indigenous girls and young people, it means they are too often unsupported in schools and public spaces and actively criminalized. And in the GTA, for example, we're seeing that play out in Peel, particularly with their school system. We're seeing it play out in the Peel's district school board, where you know, findings and the experiences of young people and their parents are outrageous when it comes to experiences of violence, of racism and anti-Black racism in particular. So, you know, I have had the honor of raising a son, you know, in Toronto. But it's also, while it's been a joy, it's also been one of sleepless nights. It's been one of constant worry. It's been one of sometimes having dreams or nightmares about his safety. You know, did he go out? Has he come home? When he leaves my house, please call me and let me know you're home safely. And why is that? That's because I know that my son has been pulled over many times by the police, and I worry about him. He's a very strong and brave and courageous and brilliant young man, and a leader in his own right. But first and foremost, what's seen is that he's Black. And so when police are pulling him over because he may be driving a lovely car, and coupled with the fact that he's Black, I worry. And so, you know, that's the experience that many Black mothers live with, is that, are their sons going to get home safely? And as a woman, that is something that tugs away and tears away of my humanity and my ability to actually not have to worry about the safety of my son. And so it's important, I think, that as we're doing this work of fundraising and funding community organizations across the country to address systemic issues of gender equality, racial equality, systemic racism, that we understand that people are living with this every day. So it's not just a matter of words that you read in articles. It's not just a matter of understanding it in terms of the theory and the ideology behind it, in terms of how you understand the work, but it's a real living life examples that folks are living with. And so the fact that we're now seeing the outcome of this triggered triggered by George Floyd's murder, the fact that we're seeing that today is not only because of George Floyd, it's because the experiences are live and direct here where we live. And so it's important to understand that the demonstrations and the protests that we're seeing in Canada, it's rooted in real life experiences. So, you know, I'm going to pass it on now to Andrea to talk about why we have to act as a foundation in the work that we're doing, but also as leaders. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Paulette. And I experience, although I'm not a mother, I'm a favorite aunt, and I've got 3 nephews, and they're all of a certain age where they're feeling their oats. They're coming into their young manhood, and I fear for their safety all the time. And it's an experience that it's not something that you're taught when you're growing up, that this is an added level of being a person of color that you also have to consider. And it's a new one for me. And I know my sister has a even more heightened level of nervousness when it comes to her sons. But it's an added burden that we have when we think about our Black sons and daughters and nephews going out, more so are the males of the population. So all of this is why we have to act. And what is it that we need to do? So for the lives of Black and Indigenous women and girls, and Two-Spirit, trans and non-binary people to be upheld in Canada, for their lives to truly matter, Police maltreatment and brutality and systemic racism must come to an end. There must be an end, period, full stop. The journey toward gender and racial justice are intertwined. We can't pursue one without the other, and an intersectional approach to pursuing a gender equal Canada requires that we address both and recognize how interconnected they are. In the past, there have been studies, numerous studies, investigations, and inquiries about what needs to happen with too many unfilled recommendations. I mentioned earlier there was an advisory committee struck. There's been several of those across the country, I can imagine, around this issue and others that have to do with racism and discrimination. But this is not enough. We've said it loud, and we're saying it loudest today that this is not enough. There needs to be more. We need systemic solutions to these policing issues in Canada. And some of those include community-led police accountability and oversight. I think that's extremely important. Performance measures based on how the most marginalized community members are served and protected. There needs to be financial consequences for poor institutional performance in addition to criminal consequences for institutional perpetrators, rather. Instead of committing billions of dollars to police and prisons, what if we prioritize proactive community-based crime intervention and prevention efforts that are proven to work? So Paulette, with that in mind, what are we committing to from a foundation perspective?
You know, over the past several weeks, we've really been thinking about my senior leadership team and I thinking about, you know, what is it that we're doing as a foundation? Now we've prided ourselves on the fact that, you know, our funding is going to grassroots community organizations across the country, that we're ensuring that it's providing support to women who have been most marginalized socially, politically, economically from society, who have had to struggle, address issues around poverty and access to services, childcare, et cetera, how critical that is. I've been engaged in this work my entire career. And so it's not just for me a matter of making sure that we're ticking the boxes, but also for me, it's to ensure that as we ourselves look at ourselves, as we evaluate the work that we're doing, we need to be confident that we haven't slipped away from this particular focus and that perhaps this is an opportunity to take a second look and see how we're doing. So it's important for us to look inward, see what we need to do to support the goals of gender and racial justice, given who we are, the Canadian Women's Foundation, and the intersection reality and identities that women bring. You know, when I think of intersectionality, because it's such a big word and lots of people are rolling it off the tongue today, but it reminds me of what I think of the origin of this understanding of what intersectionality means. And when I think of that, I think of Sojourner Truth. During the development and push in the women's movement in the US, when she was asked to speak, she said, "Ain't I a woman?" You know? And to me, that is the ultimate of what we mean by intersectionality, because she wasn't seen as a woman. She wasn't viewed as a woman. When you think of gender equality, you don't necessarily think of all the intersectional realities people bring. And at that time, when you know, the fight for freedom was really happening and Sojourner Truth's leadership was clear, she wasn't necessarily seen as having the legitimate voice of a woman. And I think we're still struggling with that today. We still have work to do in this area. And the proof of that is when you look at the stratification of access to income and livable income for people, when you look at access to jobs, when you look at access to healthcare, when you look across the board at the various systems and institutions that touch our lives, you can see who's left out and who's at the bottom. That's what happens if we're not doing the work with an intersectional, gender-based analysis plus lens. And so it's critical that we as a foundation are not just saying it, but ensuring that we're doing it and actually walking the talk. So these are some of the ways that we are declaring our support for change, but also not just support, but the ways in which we need to act. We want to ensure our funding continues to center on women and girls and two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people who are most marginalized and impacted by systemic racism. That's unquestionable. We also want to monitor and evaluate our granting approach and ensure we support Black and Indigenous programs that are led by Black and Indigenous people, right? And organizations. And we want to continue learning and acting on our commitment to equity and truth and reconciliation, which I like to call reconciliation, that we're actually taking the action, knowing that it's important that we're looking at the ways that we need to reconcile with our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Canada. And use our organizational voice to promote police accountability and anti-racist systems, as Angela was referring to earlier, transformation in law enforcement. There needs to be a transformation. Calling the police for a wellness check and ending up dead, whatever the interaction is never okay. How could that be okay? This would have to be odd for someone from outer space to come and see that this is the result. When we're calling for someone to come and help, you end up dead. That is not okay. That's what happened with Chantal Moore. That's what happened with Regis Korchinski-Paquette. This is not okay. And we also need to explore innovative approaches and partnerships to move our philanthropy, or more philanthropy, and government support to anti-racism initiatives in Canada. So I'm really pleased to see that there are movements that are happening. And so we need to monitor it, evaluate, make sure it happens. We need to fund it as a philanthropic sector. We need to fund it to make sure that it sticks. And so as we're working to really concretize these actions in things like our work plans, our program monitoring, and our evaluation, looking at our granting work, our policy work, our internal educational plans. These are all important. You know, I'm really proud to be leading a group of extraordinary staff at Canadian Women's Foundation who take this seriously and put together internal working groups to ensure that we have internal understanding of these issues. And so that internally what we're saying, we're leaving externally. And we'll be sharing progress along the way. So we encourage you to follow us on social media, join our journey of learning and unlearning, and join our email list so you can get the dates as we announce them. And so I want to invite back to the conversation Andrea Gunraj, who is gonna probably monitor and help us with some questions that may be coming from those of you who are tuning in today.
Thank you so much, Paulette. And I just want to take this moment to say thank you both for sharing those really important pieces of information and those very important perspectives right now. And I want you to also hear a thank you for sharing your personal experiences, what you yourself have gone through, and your family members and friends as well. I am very mindful that it is a burden to even share and revisit these things, and it can be very taxing. So just many thanks for sharing that right now so that folks can hear and know that you are loved and you are appreciated by the people who are at this foundation and far beyond as well too. Many thanks. I want to just go to some questions and comments that people have put out to us. And I just want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your ideas in the chat box below. I want to put this actually first to Angela. You had mentioned some of the things that have already been done, especially with respect to police accountability, transparency. And these are the things that we're hearing right now. The question is, you know, people have been saying, well, police need more sensitivity training. They need diversity training. Why don't we just focus on that? I thought perhaps that you would have something to share about this, focus on training and sensitivity. And Paulette, of course, you jump in.
Yeah, I think I hear that a lot, and I think we all do. So similar to the advisory group that tends to get struck after something like this happens, and it usually comes from the community that has been affected. So there is an outcry, and the response is, let's strike an advisory group to get at the heart of the matter, or the root of the matter. And that tends to work for a bit. People have the opportunity to voice their concerns. And then we don't tend to see, in my experience, anything beyond that. There might be one or two shifts or changes in policy or procedure, but it doesn't result in a wider overhaul of a system. And so another piece of that tends to also be in those recommendations that come out of that advisory group is, just as you've indicated, there needs to be some diversity training. There needs to be some sensitivity training. And again, what I've experienced is those are stopgap measures. They're not things or measures that get at the root of the problem. And so I think, as we've indicated here today, and what we're hearing around, around this whole issue, and I hate to kind of call it an issue because it's larger than that there needs to be a whole overhaul of the system. There needs to be accountability put in place, and there needs to be some consequences to things not changing. And I think that's larger than, although again, there is value in those training sessions. I'm not denying that. But what I've experienced is that they don't tend to change the system that we're living with from a police perspective. So I think it needs to be larger than that, and it needs to be there needs to be layers of conversation that's more than just let's get together and talk about why it should change.
I fully support what you're saying, Angela. And I remember I've been around this work on anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and police brutality for decades. I remember the Stephen Lewis report in the 90s. I was a part of the meetings where he gathered people together to talk about and to share what we thought were the issues as well as what the solutions were. And I remember he said, what we're dealing with foremost is anti-Black racism. That was in the 90s, And maybe some of you only hearing the term in the past few weeks, but it's been around a while. And maybe because we're in the midst of a pandemic, you're paying attention now more than you have in the past, and that's a good thing. And maybe it's causing alarm in you. Maybe you've been experiencing some of the trauma that we've all been experiencing for decades. I say that's a good thing. Join us in that experience. Understand what we've been going through, and understand why we're tired. Understand why we're done. I feel personally that I'm done training. I'm done sensitizing.
I've been hearing that this week as well. It's that I just had a conversation recently with a colleague who said, what is it that we're not doing? And I said to her, I've experienced the training that we developed, as you say, Paulette, 10 years ago, and I'm experiencing the training that you're doing now. And it's not enough, right? It's not enough. There's got to be more. And so just, to your point, that I think people are feeling, and I'm hoping hearing that time, not to use the time's up, but time's up, we're done, right? We're done. It's time to make some change now.
And so, I think one of the things that we've been hearing, Andrea, over the past years is that it's a few bad apples. The result of a few bad apples is that the entire stuff becomes rotten.
Exactly.
Right? The entire barrel becomes rotten. And so I agree, we need an overhaul of the system. We need some accountability, and I think it's accountability with job performance that we need to be built in, right? We need that. I know it's on the backs of people dying in Toronto specifically, why we have the SIU and possibly other similar bodies across different provinces in this country, the Special Investigations Unit, that gets, that gets right on top of whatever police interaction that's resulted in someone being harmed or killed. We lobbied and marched and fought for that for decades, but it has no teeth, And so police, they do believe that when they commit an atrocious act of brutality against Black and Indigenous people, that they can get away with it, even if it's videotaped.
Yeah.
Right. And we've seen that. We've seen, I live in Durham. Last week we had a decision on the Fonta Miller's case where what basically resulted in a slap on the wrist. The young man has lost an eye. And then he was originally charged. And of course, once they looked and realized that they can't get away with that, not only did they not alert the SIU when it happened, right? They tried to hide it, and were it not for his lawyer alerting the SIU, we would never have known about it, and a witness that was there. So, it's been happening. It's been happening without camera and with camera.
Yeah.
And it's been happening with impunity. So I'm impatient and I'm tired. That's my answer to that question.
Thank you both for that. I think the bad apples conversation has run its course, and that's where we have to look at the systemic pieces and changing things all the way through. Somebody mentioned really recently that when you get rid of all the bad apples, but the system is still so broken, it's just going to repeat itself again. So thank you so much for giving that context, and giving the context as well too about the SIU being something that was lobbied for by community and pushed for by community, and still we need more changes. I have another question from Madeline. Madeline says, how can we extend intersectionality to embrace queer and disabled communities, inclusive of gender, socioeconomic status, and racial experience as well? And I think this is a broader question around the intersectionality pieces that you both were speaking to. I think particularly of folks in mental wellness checks, mental health wellness checks. And that's where intersectionality really does play itself out. So give us a sense of some of the things that people have been talking about, solutions, particularly with respect to folks dealing with mental health issues.
Well, maybe I can begin that, Angela.
Sure.
We are in Pride Month. We're also in recognizing our Indigenous people of this land. Yeah. This month as well. And so it's a pivotal time, I think. And when you talk about Black Lives Matter and the movement that is now global, unstoppably global, I think about the Pride marches, and I think about the Pride March specifically where they stopped the parade, right? They stopped the parade and made clear what are some of the issues that the queer members of the Black community were experiencing, right? The racism that was happening, that has been perpetuated against Black people. And I was at that parade where they actually sat us down in the street and spoke to the issue to make the point clear. And I remember the backlash against Black Lives Matter. I remember everyone having something to say and how could they stop the party. And then I recall conversations I've had with my sister, who came here in, I think, 1970, and her teenage experience and memory of the raid of bathhouses and the extraordinary oppression that the LGBTQ community went through back then. And she relayed to me the origin of Pride was really about protesting the treatment of police, and Black Lives Matter was simply trying to bring that back because it really wasn't that anymore. It was all about a party, but the political messaging was thwarted because everybody was marching in pride. Gay people, straight people, trans people, everybody was marching in pride, and you never really had to understand why you were marching in pride. And in the meantime, black queer people were being brutalized. So for me, this movement, without understanding the interconnectedness of all of us as a community, when we march with our queer brothers and sisters about racism, we have to be inclusive. Our messaging must be inclusive. Our work must be inclusive, because it's clear that if one of us is touched, all of us is touched. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how light or dark we are. It doesn't matter if we're half or we're whole. It doesn't matter. It's racism. And there are particular experiences in certain aspects of the community that are important to acknowledge and recognize, but it's racism. And so we must have an inclusive movement that includes our disabled brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters who are having to struggle in different ways. They must be included, and all our non-binary people must be included in this conversation.
Well said.
Thank you so much. Now, this is a question that Noella asks. Extending support, the hand to women in the crunch of domestic violence and systemic discrimination as well. This question about what we can do to support women who have these intersectional realities in their lives that then make it difficult, as you mentioned, Paulette, to access police in a situation of domestic violence. What are alternatives perhaps out there in communities that can address domestic violence, but take away some of the concerns that people might have around calling the police or getting authorities at all involved in these situations?
Do you want to go for
Angela,
that?
maybe you could start.
No, I was just going to start with the first thing that comes to mind is some of the organizations that we partner with, that we call our partners and receive funding from us through the Canadian Women's Foundation, are women's shelters. Those organizations that are in some cases grassroots organizations or provincially funded, but are there specifically to support women in those types of situations. Now, having said that, we do know that they are few and far between. I can speak in my own province. There aren't many of those. And the sad fact is there are more women that need their services than there are organizations or institutions to provide them some assistance. But that was the first thing that came to mind. Paulette, is there anything else?
Yeah, I can certainly build on that. There's a whole conversation that's happening across this country, and in fact, across Turtle Island right now, around the role of the police, and really trying to understand whether we have just been so blind all these years, as we keep seeing our police budgets increase and increase. In Toronto, it's now over $1 billion, while community organizations that are providing life-saving work, whether to people with mental health issues or to people who are having various kinds of challenges in their lives, but saving lives as well, are left having to scramble for money, especially now during the pandemic, and instead what we're having is our tax dollars going to police where they're not equipped or capable or have the capacity to actually respond with the kind of appropriateness that we need. So if a family member, as we saw in Brampton a couple weeks ago, or the West End for sure, as we've seen with Regis in Toronto, or Chantal Moore in New Brunswick, You know, people who are in distress, family members who are in distress are calling the police and simply want help. Simply want help. They want their loved ones safe. And I think what's been demonstrated is that that model is a drastic failure, right? That's what it says to me. And so we need a kind of response that is inclusive of people who are at various touch points to keep folks safe, right? We don't need a law and order response to support people going through mental health distress. It makes no common sense to do that. It doesn't make any informed sense to do that. It's an unintelligent response. And for us to be an intelligent society, we need to demonstrate that we understand the difference between a law and order response that's needed in different ways and a supportive, helpful response that is needed in other ways. And I think what's been demonstrated is that we've been down the wrong path on this. And as a citizen, I can't even recall when that happened. I do recall, for example, I think it was in the 90s when the police, did a pilot program to enter our schools, and how distressed I was about that, because then it becomes a pipeline to jail for a lot of our kids.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this the pipeline to an early death for folks going through mental health issues? Right? And I'm not saying that they're not positive responses, but one death is too many. 3 deaths is too many. And it boggles the mind that a wellness check would actually result in that. It boggles the mind that when a woman who is experiencing abuse in the home and violence in the home calls for help, that she has to think twice about that.
About doing that, yeah.
So I think there's an opportunity here to create a model in the GBV sector. Mm-hmm. For example, there's extraordinary expertise over decades of developing the sector with shelters and services and so forth, that we could actually work with the powers that be to create a more appropriate response. Similar with CAMH and others doing work similarly in terms of mental health responses. You know, so the expertise is there. Let's not give up our power so much to the point where we're accepting that these interactions, one of the options would be that would end in death. That's not okay, or harm.
Thank you for that. And I think we have just time perhaps for 1 or 2 more questions. You mentioned the school system. And someone asks about dismantling systemic racism in the education system, because when we're talking about it, we are focused very much on police, given their role and their legitimized use of force. But we have to think about other institutions as well that intersect in our lives. And the school system is a big one that has been identified in terms of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, when you're looking at it from all the different lenses in terms of the zero tolerance policies, perhaps, when you look at the curriculum, when you look at the people who are providing education and the format of that education. So give us a sense on what can be done to address systemic racism in the school systems, and particularly around the school to prison pipeline that people talk so much about. Angela, maybe you want to start this one off?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things came to mind when I heard Paulette again, and I'll speak to kind of my experiences or my experience with this. As some of you might know, who may be on the live stream, I'm an armed forces brat, as we like to call ourselves, Army brat. So we moved around a lot. And in most cases, I was the only one in a school system of color, of any color. And the only person of African descent, almost always. When I moved back, when we lived abroad, we lived in Germany for several years, and when we moved back to Canada, I had a fairly reasonable academic career as a junior high student and high school student. But when I moved back, I was immediately placed into what they called in the school system that I came back to an adjusted class. They had access to my grades, they had access to my academic career, if you will, but the assumption was because I was Black, that that's where I needed to be placed. And I had to have, even pleading my own case in grade 7, as you know, as you try to do at that age, which is not successful when you're up against, member of society who is your elder and from a different race, and you're moved to a different country and town and trying to find your own way. But had to have my mother, my fierce mother, come in and say, this is not the place for my daughter because she is academically inclined and she's not going to be in the adjusted class. But again, confusion around what is it that I'm presenting or they're not seeing, that they've just determined that that's the place for me to be. And then having conversations with my new found friends in that new town, it was the norm. That was tracking. That's what they did with all the young Black girls and boys, and that was something that was accepted and part of the norm. So I share that to say, I think with all of these examples that we're sharing today, and I think we've indicated that it's systemic and it needs to be something that we tear it all down and we start to build it up. And I think that takes a lot of strength and expectation and fortitude and all of those adjectives. And I think we just can't be complacent. I think we have to continue, we have to utilize what has occurred and make sure that we don't lose sight of that and moving it forward and addressing all of the systems that we find ourselves in and holding them up and saying, this has to change and these are the reasons why. Beyond just the tearing down and building back up, and again, I haven't been on this planet, I've been on it for a while. I still have many years to go, hopefully. But my experience has been that the Band-Aid solutions haven't resulted in any massive change. Now, Paulette talked about 1992. I've been part of, these, as I've said, these advisory groups and these community organizations, these people that they bring together to kind of tick those boxes of to have those courageous conversations and get that input. And then what happens with that information after the fact is what we need to address and hold our leadership and ourselves accountable to making that change. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic. Let me just leave it at that.
Yeah, without optimism, we don't last.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's important to be optimistic, despite the reality of what we're seeing and experiencing. And I'm so glad you shared your experience of what is essentially streaming,
Mm-hmm.
And the practice of it. I bumped up against streaming when I first came to Canada as a kid as well. And I started in a regular class, but the teacher at the time thought, she organized the class based on your seeming academic performance, where those who were brightest were at the front and those who weren't so bright were put to the back. And based on my test results, I'd be moving back and forth because I was getting no sort of, support. And when I came here, before I came to Canada from Jamaica, I was a high performing person academically, and had skipped 1 or 2 grades before I came here. So to get a message that I was not worthy and that I was dumb was something that really played a significant number on my confidence. And by the time I got to a level of understanding, I was streamed into a grade 7 class that was so basic, it was laughable. And I don't think any of the students belonged in that class, but it was something to be filled. And so we were the fillers. But it was sold to my parents as special. And when you're telling people that something is special, they think it's good, right? And that's how we mask it in Canada. We use really nice words to mask something and sell something that is not good. So I made my way out of that. I got to university, thank goodness. Became a mom, raised a son, and realized that my almost single focused purpose was about ensuring that he made it through school. Right. And I was watching for that conversation of streaming, the one that I was watching. This kid born here, I was saying there's no way they're gonna do it. I'm an active parent in the school. I'm starting initiatives and programs. There's no way. And lo and behold, he gets to grade 7, and his lovely grade 7 teacher, French teacher, called me in to talk about my son's performance in French, and says, Mrs. Williams, which was my name at the time, I don't think that your son should really be in this class. I don't really think he belongs. And this was a late French immersion program that he was in. And I said to her, I remember saying to her, because he was only getting like 68 or something. So I said to her, the only thing that I can tell you about that is I think I want you to really raise your expectations of my son. Just raise your expectations, because if you raise your expectations of him, he'll perform. He was doing well in everything else, right? He'll perform. Well, today my son is a teacher, and one of the core subjects he teaches is French. Right? And so if I had listened to her and thought that what she was saying was truth, right, and real, then what my son's trajectory would be elsewhere.
Exactly.
Right? So I, the vigilance that we have to pay when it comes to the school system and the upheaval that it requires, particularly in terms of leadership, leadership in the schools, leadership in the classroom, leadership at the superintendent level, leadership at the board, leadership with the folks who get elected to sit on those boards. We need leadership that matters and actually cares and loves our children. Exactly. And and not see them as a threat. I remember when my son said to me in public school, Mom, I'm walking and I'm coming home from school, and I see this old white lady coming towards me, and as soon as she sees me, she crosses the street.
Yeah.
Right? It broke my heart that that's the age that my son is realizing this for the rest of his life.
And how that affects his psyche going forward. And all of those young people that don't have that support in the home or the support elsewhere, that are in those streaming classes and don't know that they could be doing, or not supported in doing better, or don't have that family member who maybe, knows who they are and what they're capable of, but doesn't have the voice or feel strong enough to say, that's not my son and that's not my daughter. She or he needs to be here. There's so many of those individuals that are in the system that just get swallowed up by it.
Yeah. So to answer the question, to get back to who we are as the Canadian Women's Foundation, that we are leading and doing our best and raising the money. It's not common for a fundraising and funding organization to be having a conversation like this. And I want to see it become common. I want us to be conscious in terms of our fundraising as well as in terms of our granting. Yes. So I'm happy to have been a part of this conversation with you, Angela, and with you, Andrea.
Likewise. Thank you so much for organizing it.
Thank you both. I just want to flag, we are almost at the end of our conversation today, and there was a few good questions around what can people do to get involved? How can people help this change process? I can think of two things right off the top of my head. I think you vote. You vote and you ask leaders to be accountable. And if they are not being accountable on these issues, they're not the ones to vote for.
Exactly.
I also think about community-based organizations. People are doing the work, people on all levels, grassroots organizations. I just know that at Canadian Women's Foundation, we see so many amazing partners around Canada doing this work. So support those efforts. They're in your community. You may not have the knowledge and the wherewithal and all the tools to be able to do it, but you can absolutely give your support, your time, your treasure, your support to these organizations doing this work. So I would really want to encourage us to do that. And I would want to encourage us as well to support the Canadian Women's Foundation in our efforts. This is all a part of our work, part of our mandate. And I think we've heard very strongly from our two leaders, incredible leaders, Paulette Senior, our president and CEO, and our board chair, Angela Johnson, really pushing for us to consider this more and do more of this that we're already doing and bump it up. It's, you know, if it's at 80%, put it to 100%. So your support is really valuable and does go to grassroots efforts doing this work, working on issues of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, ending systemic racism at large, and focusing on women and girls, trans and non-binary and two-spirit people as well, who experience all these things in spades. So yeah, I just want to reiterate that those are two things that I can think of right off the top, but there's tons of things. I would encourage you to go to CanadianWomen.org to find out all the different kind of strategies. We have a lot of things listed there. Please go ahead and take a look at those resources there as a starting place. And it's just a start, because it's also the way that we think and we behave and we act that also matters too. So many thanks again to Paulette Senior. Thank you, Angela Johnson, for being just so open right now, sharing what the foundation is doing, sharing your personal experiences as well. This is very important for us to listen to. People are speaking, we need to listen. It's not that the voices are not there, it's that we need to listen, pay attention, and act. And I just want to, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us as the Canadian Women's Foundation. Do go to our website for more information. And if you would like to support, you can support digitally online as well by giving at CanadianWomen.org. Have a great rest of the day. Stay safe, well, and please remember that we can act and we have to act. It's about time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
So looks like we're still